The argument started with a single unlocked gate, but by the end of the week, the entire neighborhood would be talking about the moment one homeowner quietly locked it and an HOA president completely lost her composure. And the twist behind that locked gate would shock everyone. For years, the lake at the edge of Oak Ridge Estates had been the neighborhood's favorite view. The water shimmered peacefully under the morning sun, and tall trees reflected across its calm surface. But there was one detail most residents didn't know: the lake wasn't owned by the neighborhood, it belonged to one homeowner, Ethan Carter. Ethan had inherited the property from his grandfather, who bought the land decades before the houses around it were ever built. The neighborhood came later, and when the developers built Oak Ridge Estates, they added a walking trail along the shoreline. The HOA liked to treat the lake like a community feature. Ethan never argued about it. Neighbors enjoyed quiet fishing afternoons, peaceful walks, and occasional kayaking. As long as everyone respected the space, Ethan didn't mind. But things changed when the new HOA president arrived. Her name was Karen Mitchell, and Karen believed the lake should belong to the entire neighborhood. The first sign of trouble came one Saturday morning when Ethan noticed something unusual. A large group of residents had gathered near the private dock. Karen stood at the center, holding a clipboard, and when Ethan walked closer, he realized something strange. Karen was organizing a community lake event. There was only one problem: she never asked the owner. Karen Mitchell spoke with confidence. Everyone deserves to enjoy the lake, she told the small crowd of neighbors gathered along the dock. Tables were being set up, kayaks were being unloaded, someone even placed a banner between two trees: Community Lake Day. Ethan stood quietly at the edge of the gathering. "Karen," he said calmly. She turned toward him with a bright smile. "Oh good, you're here. Perfect timing." Ethan looked at the dock, the tables, the people walking across his shoreline. Did the HOA approve this event? Karen nodded proudly, "Of course." Then Ethan asked the question that changed everything: did the HOA ask the owner? Karen blinked once, then laughed softly. "The lake belongs to the neighborhood view, Ethan." He shook his head slowly. "It belongs to my property." The crowd grew quieter. Some neighbors looked uncertain. Karen crossed her arms. "The HOA manages shared spaces." Ethan pointed gently toward the shoreline fence. "That fence marks the boundary." Karen dismissed the comment with a wave of her hand. "The community deserves access." That was the moment Ethan realized something important. Karen wasn't confused, she simply didn't care, and if she wanted to ignore the boundary, he would have to remind everyone exactly where it was. The next morning, something had changed. The walking trail looked the same, the lake still shimmered under the early sunlight, but the entrance gate at the shoreline was now locked. A new metal sign hung clearly beside it: private property, lake access closed. Neighbors stopped during their morning walks, staring at the gate in confusion. Kayakers turned around. Fishermen paused along the trail. Within an hour, Karen Mitchell arrived. She stepped out of her car and marched toward the gate. "What is this?" she demanded loudly. Ethan stood calmly on the other side of the fence near the dock. "Property access control," he replied. Karen shook the locked gate. "You can't block the lake." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "I can secure my property." Karen's voice rose slightly. "This is a community space." Ethan walked closer to the fence. "No," he said quietly, "it's a private lake the community enjoys." That sentence hung in the air. Neighbors gathering nearby began whispering. For years, most of them assumed the HOA owned the lake. Now they were learning something very different. Karen's expression tightened. "You're overreacting." Ethan simply gestured toward the locked gate. "You organized an event on my property." Karen stared at him, and suddenly everyone realized something. The lake they loved had one owner, and he had just locked the gate. The HOA meeting that evening was louder than usual. Residents filled every seat. Karen Mitchell stood at the front of the room, clearly frustrated. "This gate situation is unacceptable," she said firmly. Ethan sat quietly in the back row. One resident raised a hand. "Does the HOA actually own the lake?" Karen paused, then answered carefully. "The lake benefits the community." That wasn't really an answer. Another resident spoke up. "My family moved here because of the lake access." Karen nodded quickly. "Exactly." But Ethan finally stood. "The lake isn't community property." The room grew silent. He placed a folder of documents on the table. "These are the land records." Several board members leaned forward. Property boundaries clearly surrounded the lake. Karen stared at the papers. "You're saying the HOA has no authority here?" Ethan replied calmly, "Only the owner does." A quiet wave of realization spread through the room. For years the HOA had acted as if the lake belonged to them, but legally, it never had. Karen's expression hardened. "You're punishing the neighborhood." Ethan shook his head. "I'm protecting my property." And suddenly the conflict had become something much bigger than a gate, because if the lake stayed locked, the entire neighborhood would feel it. 2 days passed, and the neighborhood quickly discovered how much the lake mattered. Morning joggers missed the quiet shoreline path, children couldn't skip stones from the dock, fishing rods stayed in garages. The trail felt strangely empty. Karen's phone began filling with messages. Why is the lake closed? Can the HOA fix this? Please reopen access. Karen called an emergency HOA board meeting. We need to resolve this, she insisted, but the board had already read the property documents. There was only one solution: they had to talk to Ethan. That afternoon, Karen knocked on his door. When he answered, she spoke more carefully than before. The neighborhood values the lake, she said. Ethan nodded. I know. Karen sighed. People are upset. Ethan looked past her toward the quiet shoreline. They enjoyed something they assumed belonged to them. Karen finally asked the question she had avoided. What would it take to reopen the gate? Ethan thought for a moment, then answered calmly, one simple thing. Karen waited. Respect. And the next HOA meeting would determine whether the neighborhood was ready to give it. The following meeting felt very different. Karen Mitchell stood at the front of the room again, but this time her tone was careful. The board has reviewed the property documents, she began. Residents leaned forward. The lake is privately owned by Ethan Carter. Whispers moved through the room. Karen continued. The HOA does not control it. Ethan sat quietly as the realization settled across the crowd. Then Karen added something unexpected, however. Ethan has offered a solution. All eyes turned toward him. He stood slowly. The gate will reopen, he said. Relief spread immediately across the room, but access will follow one rule. Karen nodded for him to continue. Respect the property. No events without permission, no assumptions of ownership, just simple courtesy. Karen looked around the room, then addressed the board. All in favor? Hands rose quickly. The agreement passed, and just like that, the conflict that nearly divided the neighborhood had found a solution. But the real moment came the next morning when Ethan walked back to the gate. Sunrise painted the lake with soft golden light. Ethan walked quietly down the trail toward the gate. For several days it had stood closed, a symbol of a misunderstanding. He unlocked it slowly. The metal latch clicked open. Within minutes, neighbors began appearing along the path again. Some offered small waves, others simply smiled. The lake looked exactly the same as it always had. Calm, peaceful, welcoming. But something had changed. Karen Mitchell approached the gate. Carefully, this time her voice was calm. We appreciate you reopening it, Ethan nodded. I never wanted to close it. Karen looked across the water. Sometimes the community forgets where things come from. Ethan smiled slightly, and sometimes a locked gate reminds them. The lake returned to its quiet rhythm. Kayaks drifted gently, fishing lines touched the water again. But everyone now understood one simple truth: the lake was shared by kindness, not controlled by assumption, and that was the final twist in this unbelievable HOA story. If you loved the drama, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment sharing your thoughts. It really helps this channel grow.